Okay, good evening everyone. Shalom Aleichem and Bruchim Haba, and we continue in Daf Hashavua Masechta Nedarim, Daf Daled Amud Beis. The Gemara said on Daf Daled Amud Aleph that Mar Zutra Bereid Rav Meir said that a Nazir is over Bal Ta'acher if he delays his karbanos. So the Gemara asks, really, do we learn it from there? Do we learn it from a hekesh of Nazirus to Nedarim that a Nazir would be over on Bal Ta'acher? Why don't we learn it from the pasuk of Ki Darosh Yidrashenu, that Chatois and Ashamos, that a Nazir has offerings, he has karbanos that he must bring. So since he has to bring them, is he not chayiv in Bal Ta'acher? Why do we have to learn it from a hekesh from Nedarim? So the Gemara says, well, I would think that since Nazirus is a chidush, that maybe Bal Ta'acher doesn't apply. What's the chidush? If it's that one cannot be matfis the chatos of a Nazir beneder, meaning you can't just say, I accept upon myself to bring a chatos of a Nazir. Only a Nazir who's actually a Nazir could be chayiv in this carbon. A regular person off the street cannot obligate himself in this carbon. So I would think you're not over Bal Ta'acher. And the Gemara asks on that, there are other karbanos that you can't be matfis, you can't just be mechav yourself and you're still over Bal Ta'acher. What's the chiddush? Since if a person would say, I'm a Nazir, even from one thing, let's say, Chartzan, you're Nazir for everything, I would think you're not over on Bal Ta'acher. So therefore, the Gemara says that we need the hekesh to teach you over on Bal Ta'acher. And ultimately the Gemara asks, that chiddush is a chumrah. So why, because one chumrah applies, should the other chumrah, why would I think just because there's a chumrah by Nazir, therefore there should be a leniency in Bal Ta'acher? So the Gemara says, Mai chidusha, ela mai chidusha. What is the chidush of Nazir? That you would say because Nazir has this chidush, then Bal Ta'acher doesn't apply. The Salkadaita Chamina, I would have thought, Hoil ve'im gilach al achas mishlashtan yatsa. Since, a Nazir has to bring 3 karbanos. What are the 3 karbanos? An oila, chatas, and a shlamim. If, however, he only brings one of them, and he shaves over one of them, he's yotzei. So I would think, since there's that leniency, loy lavar aleba Bal Ta'acher, you would not violate Bal Ta'acher. Kamash malan, that that the chiddush is that he is over on Bal Ta'acher. Says the Gemara, says the Ran. Okay. So Gemara continues. What is the chiddush? Mishum doloi matfisu beneder. The chiddush is that you cannot obligate yourself in the carbon of a Nazir by making a neder. Am chayiv in the Nazir's chatas. We asked that you also can't be mechayiv yourself on the chatas of a chaylev. You can't be mechayiv yourself to bring a carbon chatas for eating chaylev, and yet there's Bal Ta'acher. V'hadu kakashal chatas chaylev. Says Gemara, chatas chaylev ka'asi l'chapara. The chatas of chaylev comes for kapara. So since you're coming to get kapara, therefore you can't delay. But chatas nazir l'mayasya. What's the carbon chatas of a nazir coming? It's not. So I would have thought it's also coming for kapara. So it's not that a nazir brings a chatas for a real kapara. It's not that he really did an avera like somebody who ate chaylev. It's just there's a certain element of kapara that's needed, but it's not for a specific sin. So therefore, I would think that you would not bring you would not be over Bal Ta'acher. So therefore, Kamash Malan, you're over Bal Ta'acher. Chatas Nozil Mai Asya. So the Gemara says, Well, v'harei chatas yoledes lo asil chapara. The karban chatas v'yoledes does not come for a kapara, and you're over mishum bal ta'achar v'avrala mishum bal ta'achar. Says Gemara vir hahi kashar yolei l'meichel b'kachim. The chatas of a yoledes allows her to eat kodshim, so therefore that carbon you would be over on bal ta'achar. So in other words, even though the karban chatas of a yoledes is not a typical karban chatas, because it's not for a specific sin, nevertheless, it does allow her to eat kodshim. It sounds like as opposed to the karban of a nazir, which somehow does not allow him specifically to eat kodshim. Which is interesting because you would think that the karban chatas of a nazir also would permit him to eat kodshim. Let's see, look at the Ran. Kasharye l'meicha b'kodshim, k'dachsiv v'chiper olah ha'kohen v'tahira. The kohen will atone for her and she'll be pure. V'achilas kodshim mitzvahi, k'goyin achilas psachim, da'isha nami mechayva. A woman is also chayiv in eating kodshim. So it sounds like that by a nazir, once he's tahar, even before he brings the carbon, he would be allowed to eat kodshim. So therefore, there would be no isser of baal ta'acher. Okay. Amar Mar. We said earlier, Uman Nedarim, just like Nedarim, ha'av mefer nidrei bitay, a father could annul his daughter's Nedarim. Ubal mefer nidrei ishtay, af naziros, ha'av mefer naziros bitay. So too by naziros, a father could annul his daughter's naziros. Ubal mefer naziros ishtay, and a husband could annul the naziros of his wife. Okay, so the Gemara continues. Gemara asks, Lamali hekesha, why do I need a hekesh to learn out naziros from Nedarim? Why do I need a hekesh? A hekesh is the fact that they're juxtaposed. Why can't I make a straight up mamatzinu? Namely, just like Nedarim, you could be mefer nidrei ishtai v'nidrei bitay, so too by naziros you could do it. Why do I need the special hekesh? Why can't I make a mamatzinu? Lamali hekesha teisi b'mamatzinu b'nedarim. Says Gemara, no. The difference between a hekesh and a mamatzinu is on a hekesh ein makshim al hekesh. You cannot question, you cannot refute a hekesh. A mamatzinu, you could make a pircha kaldahu. By mamatzinu, the way mamatzinu works is if a halacha applies by A, we should carry it over to B. But that is easily refuted with what we call a pircha kaldahu, as opposed to a hekesh. You cannot just refute a hekesh. So Gemara is saying, no, dilma gami nedarim hu demefer. Maybe you can only annul a neder mishum deloi islay kitzusa, because a neder does not have a finite limit, meaning it's endless. If you answer something, it will be forever. So therefore, you can be made for it. Avagabi naziris islay kitzusa, naziris that has an end. The stam naziris shloshim yom, stam naziris is 30 days. Emalai, I would say not. Kamash malan. So it comes to teach us that it is possible to be mefer. The Ran says, Mishum delesle kitzusa hilkach dinhu shayafer. It's logical that you can be made for it. Shaloi titstar bebeis ha'ilama, so she should not be in pain forever. Okay. Says the Gemara, Ha'omer lechaveroi mudarani, one who says to his friend, mudarani, I am asar. This is going on the opening Mishnah. One who sends to his friend, mudrani mimcha, I am Aser and avow to you, Mufrashani mimcha, Meruchukani mimcha, and then this is what we call Yadais Nedarim, Sha'ani oichalach, Sha'ani toyim lach, Aser. So the Gemara says, Amar Shmuel said, now technically you could have read the Mishnah, that whether you say Mudrani mimcha, or if you say Sha'ani oichalach, it's Aser. Or you could read it, Mudrani mimcha, Sha'ani oichalach. Either of these different statements are independent statements, or you could read it, Mudrani mimcha, I am Aser and avow to you, Sha'ani oichalach, that I'm going to eat from you. So Shmuel's opinion is that it's only effective if you say both of them. Amar Shmuel, B'kulan, by all of them, Ad sheyomer, until you say Sha'ani oichalach, Sha'ani toyim lach, that I'm going to eat, that I'm going to taste. It's not enough to say Mudrani mimcha, Mufrashani mimcha, you have to say Sha'ani oichalach. Says the Ran, B'kulan, ad sheyomer Sha'ani oicha, B'kulan, dahainu Mudrani, Mufrashani, Merchukani, demasnisan ad sheyomer, V'chulo, kolomer, demasnisan chada katani. The Mishnah is saying one case. V'sha'ani oichel, and Sha'ani oichel, Mudrani, Mufrashani kai. It's going on in Mudrani, Mufrashani, the ilav hachi, otherwise, le mashma iser klal. It's not mashma in Isra at all. If you don't say Sha'ani oichel, it's not mashma Isra at all. V'afilu yad she'enu meichiach lo havi. It's not even a handle that's not conclusive. It's not a handle at all. A handle means, what's the logic of Yadais Nedarim? A handle is you are holding on to the handle of a cup, so by holding the handle it picks up the rest of the cup. Now some type of Yadais are more indicative, that you're making another, others less so. If you don't say Sha'ani toyim lech, Sha'ani oichalach, it's not even a handle that's not indicative. That's how clear the statement would be. So Shmuel says it's one long statement. So the Gemara asks, Meisvei, we're going to challenge what Shmuel taught. Mudar ani mimcha, mufrashani mimcha, merchulkani mimcha, where this brisa says just the cases of mudar, mufrashani, merchulkani, hareza aser. Shani oichalach, shani toyim lach, hareza aser. So here it says explicitly, these are independent cases. You could either say mudrani, mufrashani, merchulkani, or you could say shani oichalach, shani toyim lach. So Gemara says hachik time. This is what it means to say that ba'medvar mamurim ba'omer shani oichalach, shani toyim lach. What are we speaking about? Where you say not only mudrani mufrashani, but sha'ani oichalach, sha'ani toyim lach. Says the Ran, Meisei mudrani mimcha bishlama masnisen. Bishlama, the Mishnah, is not a question on Shmuel, like kasha the Shmuel. The kivan d'loi tani ba elachad asur. Since the Mishnah only says asur one time, ikalameimar, you could easily say the seifa perusha the Reisha. The end of the Mishnah is explaining the Reisha. Avo brisa the tani asur, but the brisa that says asur twice, mashma le de mili katani. It's mashma. It's two separate cases. The iloi, because if it's not loi lema asur ad seif, it should not say asur until the end. Umetaretz, and the Gemara's answer is hachi kamar. This is how you read the brisa. Ba'medvar mamurim. When do we say mudrani mimcha mefreshani mimcha is asur? That's when you add shani yoichalach shani toyim lach mishum hachi shaykh lemisni aser be'emtza dvarav. Therefore, it could say aser in the middle of its words. Now later on, the Gemara is going to ask, why did it have to say aser the second time? Why would I need the second aser? Really, the Gemara could have asked this question immediately. The Gemara is asking a better question right away, which we're going to see. We learned in a brisa the opposite. Where we have a brisa that says shani oichalach, shani toyim lech aser. First, it picks the latter cases that I'm going to eat from you, that I'm going to taste from you. It's aser. Mudrani mimcha mefreshani mimcha merchukani mimcha reza aser. See the Ran v'atanya ibcha hach brisa lav sefer the brisa del elhu. This brisa is not the end of the previous brisa. And how do I know that? It could have said, otherwise it would have said, but it says in the Seifa. So this is not the Seifa of the previous Brisa. This is a separate Brisa altogether. And in this Brisa, it flips the cases. It first says, Shani oichalach, Shani toimlach, and then it says, Mudrani mimcha, murchukani mimcha. Says the Gemara, Tani hachi. It means like this. You know when Mudrani mimcha, murchukani mimcha, you know when Shani oichalach, Shani toimlach is asur. If you had already said in the beginning, Mudrani mimcha mefrushani mimcha, ukfar omar mudrani, if you first said mudrani, look at the Ran, Tani hachi ukfar omar kolaymar b'kamash malan, da'af agav the kfar omar mudrani mimcha, tzarach loymar shani oichalach, even though you already said mudrani mimcha, you need to say shani oichalach, di'iloi loy mitzar. Now it's interesting, there's a similar thing to this in this Parsha, where Eliezer gives her the, when he says over the story, he says, first I asked her who she was, and then I put it on her hand. Now, when the Torah says what he did, it says he put it on her hand, he put the jewelry on her hand, and he asked her. So, that seems to imply he gave her the jewelry without asking who she was. And Rashi says, yeah, he had bitachon, but he was afraid to tell Lavan and Besul, that's what he did. The Ramban says, no, the pasuk means exactly what the Gemara just said. He gave it to her after having already asked her before. Like the Gemara says here, Shani oichalach, shani toimlach is aser after having already said, Mudrani mimcha, mefreshani mimcha. So Gemara asks, Ihachi hani reisha. First of all, that's the reisha. Reisha here doesn't mean the beginning of the brisa, it means the first brisa. Says the Ran, Tani hachi ukvar amar kalamer v'kamash malan. Okay, we did that, Ran. The second wide line, Ihachi hani reisha, lab reisha mamish kamar, doesn't actually mean the reisha. Ela kivan de aisi hach brisa kamaisa, since it brought the earlier brisa. Mekami hach, before this, Karile Reisha. It's called the Reisha. Kolaymar Rishaina. Vahachi Perusha. This is what it means to say. I Amrit Bishlama Madrani Bilchud Aser. If you're going to say Madrani alone is Aser, Mishum Hachi Shani Haitanya. That's why the second Tana deviated. Vinaka Madrani B'Seif. And it put Madrani in the second case, so that you don't mistakenly think it's all one case. Madrani mecha mefrushani mecha shani oichalach. Uvamed dvar mamurim katani. Ube even though the first Tana wasn't worried you'd make this mistake, Hi Tana Ratzal Variosa. This Tana wanted to clarify. Meaning the first Tana thought, I already said Asr twice, nobody's going to mistakenly think you need to say both. This Tana wanted it to be crystal clear that Mudrani Mimcha, Mufreshani Mimcha alone is Asr. But if it's one matter, you need to say Mudrani Mimcha Shani Oichalach Havle Lahai Tana Nami Lemisni Ki Idach Tana. Then this second Tana should have also said it in the same order. Utfei Shaykh Lemisni Ba'med Dvar Mamurim Midelemismi Ukfar Amar. It's much easier to say Ba'med Dvar Mamurim, one long case, than to say, if you already said. Meaning, originally, when we asked from the Brisa, where it said Asr twice, we asked, it sounds like it's two separate cases, and the answer was, no, case one works when Ba'med Dvar Mamurim, where you also added on Shani Oichalach. That's a much easier squeeze, meaning there are two dechukim. You see, Brisa number 1, it says, Modrani mimcha mefreshani mimcha, aser, shani oichalach shani taimlach, aser. How does that fit into Shmuel? Shmuel will say, Modrani mimcha mefreshani mimcha. You know when it's aser? Ba'medvar mamurim, when you also clarify shani oichalach shani taimlach. The style of the first brisa is ba'medvar mamurim. That's a much easier style than what we have to do in the second brisa. In the second brisa, we first say shani taimlach, shani oichalach, and then aser, madrani mimcha mefreshani mimcha aser. You need to do both. It means shani oichalach, shani taimlach is aser when ukvar amar, if you had already previously said madrani mimcha. So what the Gemara is asking is that if each one is aser by itself, that's why the second Tana went out of its way to say it backward, because saying it backward is much more conclusive that each one alone is aser. Because it's much harder to interpret the brisa, ukavar omar, than interpreting it the way we did in the first brisa, that bamedvar mamurim. Meaning in the first brisa it's easier to be madcha, to say, if you say A, it's aser if you also add B. Also adding B is an easier interpretation than B is aser if you already did. In other words, what are we doing to the second brisa? To the second brisa, we're reading it. The second brisa reads shani oichalach shani taimlach. You know when shani oichalach shani taimlach is aser? If you already in the beginning said mudrani mimcha merchakani mimcha, that's much more difficult. So I would understand why this Tana went out of his way to list it in the other way around, because it's much more difficult to be madcha that it's one long case. So bishlama, if each case is aser by itself, I understand why this Tana went out of his way to flip it around, to indicate that each one is aser by itself. But if it's one long case, why would this Tana say it backward? Eli amr techada milsa katani. Then this second Tana should have used the same style as the first Tana, because that's a much easier style to explain that A is aser when you also say B. Eli amr techada milsa katani havle lahai Tana nami lemisni kiidach Tana utfei shaykh lemisni ba'medvar mamurim. It's much easier to interpret ba'medvar mamurim lemisni ukvar amar than to interpret ukvar amar. Va'oid, and another problem with this way of learning is it's really difficult to say both a style of ba'medvar ma'murim, A is aser when you also add B, or A is aser when you already said B before, because it says aser twice. Va'oid aser aser lamali misni klamar aser deseifa kashale. We're asking, the Ran is clarifying that originally the question was, why does it say aser twice? Why does it say aser in between? To that the Gemara says, ba'medvar ma'murim, that it is aser provided you added the second thing. But now we're asking, why do I need the second iser? Va'id aser lamali lemisni, meaning why do I need the second iser? Okay, and that's where we'll hold it. That will be the end of this week's Amud, and we'll pick it up as a Hashem next week. Thank you very much for joining late Thursday night. Great to see everyone, and I wish you all bracha v'atzlacha. Kol tov.
Recording stopped.
Good night, everyone. Kol tov. Good night. Good night.